In today's class, we are going to begin a new chapter, the Mauryan Empire. Now, for today's class, we will actually just go through the a brief introduction of the topic and we will discuss a few literary sources of this period. So, as you are already familiar with this topic, you have studied some parts of it in class 6. You know that the Mauryan Empire was founded by Chandragupta Maurya. Now, when we discuss a little bit about Chandragupta Maurya, his entire history is not very known, it's not very clear because the period we are talking about is ancient history. And however much we have tried to reconstruct the history, some parts of it are still missing. So, very little is known about the early life of Chandragupta Maurya. What we know is that he had joined as a part of the Alexander's army. Alexander the Great, you may know, is one of the greatest conquerors known. So he had Alexander had extended up to the northwestern part of India, and Chandragupta Maurya, being very ambitious and very talented, he was a part of his army and had taken some form of training from there. So gradually with time, what happened simultaneously, what was happening, you remember that we had covered in the last chapter that there were many janpadas and there were many mahajanpadas in the country. One of the very important mahajanpadas in India at that time was Magad, and Magad was under a dynasty which was called the Nanda dynasty. During this time, the Nanda dynasty was under its last ruler called Dhanananda, who was very corrupt and who was unliked by the people. The people also did not want him as their ruler. So at this point of time, simultaneously, Chandragupta Maurya was receiving his training and he was a part of the army. What happened was a very famous Brahmin scholar used to stay in the Nanda court. His name was Kautilya, which you already know as whom you already know as Chanakya. So there is an incident regarding Chanakya that he had applied for a post as a Brahmin scholar, as a minister for the kingdom of the Nandas. But he was insulted. He was not very pretty looking, so he was made fun of and laughed at. So this made him very, very angry and he decided to take revenge. And for this purpose, he started looking for options to take revenge. And when he found out, maybe later through conversation or anywhere, that there is a so-called talented and ambitious man, Chandragupta Maurya, he decided to help him. And with the help of Kautilya, Chandragupta Maurya, gradually he started forming an army. So first he conquered a small part of Punjab, and from there he attacked the Magad area and defeated the Nanda. At the same time, the northwestern part of the country was under a small tribe called the Greek satraps. He also removed them and he established altogether a new empire which was called the Mauryan Empire. The beauty of this Mauryan Empire is that the word we say empire was used for Indian history for the first time. Prior to this, before this, whatever we had, they are instances of dynasty. That means they were localized, they were smaller areas. But this was like a first all Indian attempt which brought almost most of India under its control. This was the first such kingdom that could do so, and that is why we refer to it as an empire which was very, very vast in expanse. So, Chandragupta Maurya, he founded this Mauryan Empire and he was succeeded later by his son Bindusar. Bindusar maintained the empire and he was responsible for a little bit expansion towards the south. The most famous ruler of this dynasty, this empire, as you know, is Ashoka. So here I have mentioned the timeline of the rulers who were there. Chandragupta Maurya was naturally the founder, who ruled from 322 BC to 298 BC. He was succeeded by his son Bindusar, who sat on the throne from 298 to 273 BC. Later, he was succeeded by his very young son Ashoka, who sat on the throne on 273 BC and he ruled till 232 BC. Following Ashoka were a series of weak successors who could not sustain the mighty Mughal Empire, and later, around 182 BC, a Brahmin called Pushyamitra Sunga overthrew the Maurya dynasty and the Shunga dynasty came into existence. So the Mauryan dynasty, it collapsed, it ended in 182 BC. Now, after Chandragupta Maurya had already found the empire and Bindusar had extended it, the main credit, the main person whom we mention regarding the Mauryan Empire is Ashoka, because his period is considered to be one of the brightest periods in Indian history. The reason being, you are all familiar with the Kalinga War which changed his life, and after the Kalinga War, how he gave up warfare and he adopted the peace of peaceful conquest or Dhamma. After this Kalinga war, he started focusing on the welfare of his subjects. So much so that the subjects considered him like their own father. He made a number of stupas, a number of viharas, a number of pillars were instructed during his period. He made which were marvels of art and architecture. He worked for the improvement of his subjects. In fact, the national emblem which we have with the four lions that has also been taken from Ashokan period, and so has the Dharm Chakra Pravartan. That means the turning of the wheel of law. So that means the Ashoka Chakra, which is a part of our national flag, that has also been taken from this period itself. So then this in itself should tell you how important this period was in Indian history, that so many of our national symbols have been derived from it. So let's move further and discuss the literary sources now. The first literary source of this period is Arthashastra, which was written by Kautilya. Now, like I already mentioned, that Kautilya was very, very close to Chandragupta Maurya. He was the one who had advised him, who had helped him, and with his wit, with his tactics, Chandragupta Maurya was able to defeat the Nandas and establish the Mauryan Empire. So naturally, Chandragupta Maurya held him in a very high esteem, and he gave him the post of his prime minister and chief advisor. So Kautilya was able to observe the Mauryan Empire very, very closely. So his accounts are considered to be a very reliable one. Kautilya was also known by the name of Vishnu Gupta or Chanakya, and this work, Arthashastra, which he had written, it is a very, very famous work. It is a very detailed manual which deals with politics. That means all the politics regarding the working of the government. How should a ruler be? How should he treat his subjects? What should be his policies regarding conquering new areas? Rules of diplomacy, that means what kind of friendly diplomatic relations he should maintain with the neighboring states. What were the principles on which administration should be based? What should be the trade of this period? All of these things about administration, trade, and politics, they have been in a very detailed manner been explained in this book, Arthashastra. So much so that it is still today called one of the best political treatises in Indian history. And in fact, even today, if you find books on politics on Amazon, you will find Chanakya Niti or Politics of Chanakya, these kind of books, because that was the level of politics that he had dealt with so much so early in the Mauryan period. Now, this book actually was discovered in the year 1909 by an Indian scholar called R. Shama Shastri. The Britishers, when they were in India, they were very interested in the Indian history. So, some scholars worked under them in the Archaeological Survey of India, and they tried to revive India's past. And it was then in 1909 that R. Shama Shastri, he discovered the Arthashastra, which he translated to English language in 1915. So we know about Arthashastra that it was written in Sanskrit language. It contains around 6,000 shloks, which are divided into 15 sections and many around 180 subsections. So when I talk to you about Arthashastra, I may ask you a question: who has written the Arthashastra and what does it contain? So you will say Arthashastra is written by Chanakya or Kautilya, who was the prime minister and chief advisor of Chandragupta Maurya. The Arthashastra is a comprehensive manual which deals with the politics, rules of diplomacy, principles of administration, and such political topics of the Mauryan period. It is considered as one of the best political books written in India. Now, moving ahead to the last part of today's class, the last literary source that we are dealing with is Indica. Now, Indica has been written by a Greek ambassador called Megasthenes. Now, you should be aware, you have again studied about this in class 6, that Chandragupta Maurya was in the northern part of India, but in beyond the northwestern part of India, there was a Greek ruler called Seleucus Nicator, who was actually, you can say, a representative of Alexander and was taking care of his territories after Alexander had left. And we will study later that there was a war between Chandragupta Maurya and Seleucus Nicator, in which Chandragupta Maurya won. So later, as a peace offering, Seleucus Nicator had sent an ambassador, he had sent a person as a friendly exchange, and his name was Megasthenes. So Megasthenes came to the court of Chandragupta Maurya and stayed for a period of around 5 years. Whatever he observed around, that he compiled in a book which was called the Indica. So the Indica, it contains a lot of information about Indian society and Indian administration. Whatever things he observed, what were the conditions of the foreign travelers who came in India at that point of time. Then when he was traveling, when he came via the route of Mathura. So he saw that the roads were very well maintained, and on both sides trees were planted for the benefit of the travelers. how the king, they treated all the laws equally for everyone, what were the trade relation during this period, all these which he had observed very closely, he penned it down into a book called Indica. Now, the unfortunate thing is that since it has been so many years, the original copy of Indica has been lost. But later, many Greek authors like Strabo, Arrian, Justin, Diodorus, they have tried to recreate Indica from whatever fragments, whatever pieces of the book they could find. So this version that we have available right now, that is an updated version that has been created by the Greek authors, because the original copy of Indica is lost. This question comes very, very often in the examination. Who was Megasthenes? What does his book contain? So you will say Megasthenes was a Greek ambassador who came from the court of Seleucus Nicator to the court of Chandragupta Maurya. He wrote a book called Indica, which contains detailed information about Indian society and administration. So basically in today's class we have just done an introduction. We have talked about the founder and the important rulers of the Mauryan Empire, which we will talk about in the further classes also. So we discussed about Chandragupta Maurya, how with the help of Kautilya he was able to secure and establish the Mauryan Empire, how he was succeeded by Bindusar and his most famous son Ashoka, who made the empire as popular as it is today. And then we discussed the two literary sources, the Arthashastra written by Kautilya, how it is the best political treatise in Indian history. And lastly, we talked about Indica, which was written by Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador of Seleucus Nicator, and how the original book has been lost and we now have a recreated version. So I hope today's class is clear to all of you and you were able to follow it thoroughly. Thank you.